Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Measuring Outcomes Workshop. My name is Krista Brown, and I'm the APS Leaders Institute Program Coordinator with APS Workforce Innovations, APSWI. And I'm here with my colleague, Rabaz Taha, our operations coordinator, and I will be moderating and Rabaz will be providing tech support. And we're also here with our colleague, Lori Della Grammaticus from NAPSA, and she'll be helping us as well. So we want to welcome you all to this workshop. Before I get into the kind of the nitty gritty of housekeeping, I do want to introduce our presenters. We are so lucky to have the both beloved and esteemed presenters, Mary Toomey and Marion Liu, with us today and for the booster on May 5th. Mary Toomey is a consultant in elder justice and APS issues. Most recently, she was the Aging Program Specialist at the Administration for Community Living, Office of Elder Justice and APS. Previously, Mary was co-director of both the National Center on Elder Abuse and the Center of Excellence on Elder Abuse and Neglect at the University of California, Irvine. We also have Marion Liu. She is an assistant professor at Purdue School of Nursing and faculty associate in the Center on Aging and the Life course at Purdue. She conducts applied and translational research around elder justice issues, covering topics on elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Dr. Liu works nationally with APS programs at the county and state level and was funded by the Administration for Community Living to measure effectiveness of APS referrals and services. She's also the co-chair of the National Adult Protective Services Association and National Committee for Prevention of Elder Abuse, so NAPSA and NCPE, the research committee. So welcome both Mary and Marion. And for those of you who are just coming on in, we are just getting started here. We are going to be recording the presentation portion of the workshop today. And that'll be shared with anyone who's registered and cannot join us today. And if you have not done so already, please go ahead and type your name, title, and county, and one thing that you'd hope to take away from this workshop today. And let me just get through our housekeeping and then we can hand it on over. So the APS Leaders Institute is a program of APSWI, and APSWI is a program of the Academy for Professional Excellence. And APSWI specifically provides innovative workforce development to APS professionals and their partners. And the Academy as a whole provides workforce development and learning experiences to health and human service professionals. And there are some of the Academy programs there on the right. Oh my gosh, Zoom. I think at this point we are all very familiar with Zoom, but for those of you who maybe took a little time off last year and are coming back to the virtual world, we are using Zoom for our workshops. And we do want to hear from you. So if you would like to mute and unmute yourself, go ahead and have yourself muted when you're not speaking, but we love live questions and participation, so feel free to unmute yourself. We also love to see you, so if that is a possibility for you to start your video and have it on, that is wonderful. And it's good to see everyone's faces in this time when we can't be together in a training room. And we will be going into breakout groups, so that's also very handy. You can see who else of your colleagues is online in the participants tab. And most importantly, we use chat. So have your chat box open, and we've already been using it, and we will continue to use it. You can also private chat either Rabaz or I with any technical questions. And if you need to step away during the course of the workshop, please go ahead and give us a BRB, be right back. That really helps with our small breakout group organization. And then reactions. If you feel like you want to raise your hand for a question, or you want to give somebody a thumbs up or a celebratory emoticon, please feel free to go ahead and do that. That's kind of fun. Okay, so we are together today from 9 to 11, and we encourage you to stay on for the entire workshop. Rabaz has sent out a couple times to you prior to this workshop your participant materials, participant manual. You will need that. We will be doing a breakout activity, and Rabaz has posted the PDF of the manual in the chat box if you need to go ahead and open that up and access it right now. But we're going to be doing a breakout group with the handy dandy outputs and outcomes matrix that Marion and Mary created, and also the CWDA budget fact sheet, and it has all of your slides as well. So go ahead and have that handy. We'll have time at the end for the evaluations, and we'll be talking about our booster on May 5th. I think some points to consider for our outcomes. I just want to kind of harken back to some of our previous workshops, and in particular, the understanding the legislative process when both Diana and Carol and Kim were talking about using data and stories, and outcomes. Outcomes data can very much be used for bolstering a case, in support of a budget or a legislative proposal. And outcomes actually kind of crosses everything that we've been doing. So just wanted to kind of make those connections and tie those strings. So, and I think Mary, I think I am done, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it on over to you. Just let me know when you want your slides forwarded.
Yeah, let's actually, could you go back to the slide previous?
Sure.
So first of all, hello everyone. It's great to be with you here today. Pretty much I would do anything Marion, Lori, Krista, or Rabaz asked me to do, which is how I ended up here talking to you about a topic that I find very confusing. So one of the things that I'm pretty sure I can promise today is that Marion and I are going to disagree about whether this is an output or an outcome. And we would appreciate your voice when we get to that point. We're like, I don't know, output, outcome. So the reason I didn't want to forward to the next slide just right this moment is I wanted to give you a little bit of a roadmap about what's going to happen right now. And with the great presentation about the difference between outputs and outcomes, which, as I said, I find very confusing myself. So, but we will do our best. And then Marion is going to talk about what does the research say about what are APS outcomes? Where has there been research done in APS outcomes? So an amazing overview of some of the findings from research that's been done in the last, well, Marion will tell you how far back she went in her literature review. Then together we've sort of crafted this matrix, which we hope will be really helpful to you in going from, on the left-hand side, outputs to going to how would you measure outcomes. I noticed in the chat, people seem to be particularly interested in not only identifying what are the outcomes, but how do you measure them? And that's a very, very good question. So we are hoping that this sort of matrix that we've created might be useful to you. So in fairness, I thought it would only be right and just if I started by telling you what my hoped for outcomes are for today. So before we start talking about what are the challenges of studying outcomes. So if we start with outputs, which we're going to talk about in a second, some of the outputs are things, that most of the time you're just like, oh, super easy. Those are easy to measure. So some of the things that would be outputs for today's time together would be how many people are with us today and how many hours are we going to be in training. So those are some outputs, but the outcomes, which are sort of what I consider your hopes, your dreams, your IRAs. So what are my hopes for today? So my hopes for today, which we'll talk about how we're going to measure whether my hopes come true, my dreams come true, are that you all have a greater comfort in identifying outcomes and understanding the difference between outputs and outcomes, and that this application of this framework that we've developed would be used by you. So we can talk about how we'll know whether you have a greater level of comfort talking about outcomes at the end, or whether you use the framework a little bit later. Now, and I wanted to also introduce you to my co-presenter, who is Smokey the cat, who has very lovingly decided to sleep behind me here. So she will be the star of the show, of that I am certain. All right, let's go. Thanks, Krista. So I was like, I don't know, do you want to start with the challenges of talking about why it's so challenging to study APS outcomes? But I feel like it's as good a place to start as any, because it does make it clear to you that this isn't easy. There's a reason that we don't have a ton of literature about studying APS outcomes, and there's a reason that there's more studying going on right now. So, one of the first things is that there's, even in California, I think we all have to admit there's a wide variability within the state and within APS programs. And one of the things about outcomes is you're trying to usually measure apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And if you have like apples, bananas, berries, and oranges in there, it's really, really hard. So that's one thing that I think we have to recognize both around the country and even within California. So again, we don't have performance data at the national level. NAMERS does not collect performance data, as you know. There's some things about NAMERS that could be useful in studying outcomes, but mostly we're not looking at performance data. And then, so what's the theoretical framework for analyzing APS? What is the goal of APS? Do we have a framework? I think we're beginning to have a framework for analyzing APS, but for example, some studies that came out of LA, looking at the forensic center there, they were looking at what were some of the outcomes of the forensic center, and some of them were guardianship or rates of prosecution. And then they got a lot of, not so much criticism, but just some commentary about, well, is that the goal of APS, to put people under conservatorship and put them and prosecute cases? So I feel like we're still working on, well, what is the goal? Clearly the goal is to reduce risk and increase safety, but what does that look like for any particular client or any particular program? So we're still working on that. What is an outcome? As I just said, is conservatorship an outcome for adult protective services? Can we agree on what are some of the outcomes? I'm involved in a study right now, an APS client outcome study. So we're looking at, this is a little bit of a sneak peek, but we're looking at client satisfaction, safety and risk, and well-being, client well-being. So, but there are many more client outcomes. And we're not even just talking about client outcomes today. We're going to be talking about worker outcomes, and we're going to be talking about program or system outcomes. And data is limited, but it is improving both at the national level with NAMERS, and I think every state, and hopefully some of the new federal money, will be helping states to create better data systems. All right, let's go to the next slide. So a nod here to Carl Urban, who developed this slide for a different presentation that he and I were doing together. But I like this, like the challenges of studying APS outcomes in one slide. It's a bit of a reiteration, but I wanted to draw your attention to the far left column. So we're talking about, well, so what types of outcomes are we talking about? Are they your program outcomes? So a program outcome would be, so how effective is the program in meeting its goals, but whose goals? Your statutes goals, your regulations goals. System outcomes are the most confusing to me because sometimes they sound like outputs. So percentage of cases that are started within the time that your statute or your regs say they have to be started, number of cases that are closed within the time that your statute or regulations say they have to close. So how effective, how efficient is your system? Worker outcomes would be something like how much is job retention? What are your rates of job retention? What are your rates of worker satisfaction? What is your worker competency or efficiency? And then of course the holy grail of outcomes, which is how has the contact with APS changed the life of the client? So client satisfaction, client risk and safety, et cetera. So data sources, namers, right now, the only study that I'm aware of that's using namers data and looking at outcomes is looking at namers data and examining how many clients are returning to the APS system. So this would be a national study looking at the number of clients who return to APS within 3 months, 6 months, or a year. What are the characteristics of those people? Namers can help us do things like that. Are there systems within California that would be able to give you some of that information so you could do an outcome study related to um, what are the characteristics of clients who reoccur in California? In the third column, measuring outcomes in APS is really difficult because, like, normally if we were looking at an intervention, so a certain kind of chemotherapy, for example, or a drug of some other kind, you would establish a group that did not get the drug and a group that got the drug. Obviously, we can't do that with adult protective services. Those days are long past where we can say, oh no, these people will not get adult protective services and these people will. So it's difficult because some of the practices that you would do for research, you just can't do. Most APS programs don't do client assessments to find out how what the client feels about his or her interaction with APS, though I would notice that in the adult protective services, voluntary adult protective services guidelines that the ACL put out, that it does recommend that clients be sent some sort of satisfaction survey at some point after the case closes. So, and then of course, the big one is there are multiple people usually interacting with our clients. And so who gets to take credit for the positive change and who gets to take the onus if there's perhaps not positive change in the client's condition because of the final column, which is, it's not APS, it's not within APS's power to fix structural issues like poverty, social isolation, racism, and income inequality. So we have to work within a system, within these systems, with data that's not great, with the inability to have a control group, with the APS workers lament. But can we still talk about outcomes and outputs? Absolutely. Can we still measure them? Absolutely. So let's go to the next slide. So this is our first, is this a poll, Krista? Yeah. So this is our first poll. And the poll question is, a mother, could be a father, goes to the store to buy a birthday cake for her child's 5th birthday. Which of the following are the outcomes related to that action? So I'm sure the poll is open. Is the birthday cake the outcome, the output?
And yes, the poll is open and there is a bit of a horse race going on.
Dun, 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 dun.
All right. All right. Those of you who have not voted, we'll have a couple more seconds and then we will end it. Come on, let's get to 90%. Okay, cool. All right. I am going to share the results. There you go.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. This group is brilliant. So absolutely, the outcome, the hope, the desire, the mother goes to buy a birthday cake and all the other accoutrements for her child's birthday with the goal of hoping that the outcome is that there will be a happy 5-year-old. The cake and the party, and you could have added here candles or balloons or anything else that sort of attended all of this, are the outputs. These are the things that help drive you towards your hope. Your hope is that you have a happy 5-year-old. I thought it would be worth mentioning here that an unintended outcome could also be a really bedraggled parent, but we didn't add that one in. All right, let's go to the next one. So we have something a little bit closer to home, and can I move this? Yes, I can. I can move anything I want. Sorry. So the next poll, we wanted to get a little closer to home, as I said. So you're holding a training for your workforce, and it's on domestic violence, clients who are experiencing domestic violence, it's for your workers. Which of the following are outputs of that training? The number of people who attend the training, the number of hours of training completed, the number of people who rated the training excellent or very good, or my very favorite, the number of people who said the room was too cold. Or is it all of them?
All right, the poll is open. And that is actually one thing I do not miss of being in person with you all, is the too cold or the too warm room. All right, horse race is going. All right, let's give it a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now and share results. There you go.
Again, well done. Great job, all. Yes, because all of the options here are outputs. So the things that you can measure are the number of people who attended the training, the number of hours completed, but these were not goals. The goal is not that you have so many people attend the training. I mean, in your mind, you want so many people, just like today, we want so many people to be there, but the goal is that you have a better understanding of outputs and outcomes at the end. The goal is you feel more competent. The goal is you have a greater sense of satisfaction about your ability to do something. So the number of people who attended today's training, the number of hours completed, even your rating, which it's important to know how satisfied you are, but the rating itself is not the outcome. And the number of people who said the room was too cold was just to be funny. Okay, so you did great. Those were all outputs. So let's turn to outcomes. And the same question. You hold a training on working with clients who are experiencing domestic violence. And Krista, is there a way to not broadcast the poll results as the poll is being as open? Share results post?
Actually, you were only seeing that horse race.
Oh, am I? Okay, so I can get rid of that horse race. Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Because for me, I would be like, what is everybody else doing? I'm going to vote the way everybody else is voting. That would be so we're going, so the outputs are the action or items we've talked about that contribute to achieving the goal. What is your goal? So they're the means to an end. And what are some, just in general, what might be some outputs from, not from this training, but for generally for APS that come to mind? So what are you, when you think of your program, what are some of the things that you measure?
And you can unmute yourself or use the chat box.
This is Michael in first. So, you're looking at risk and safety as one of the key things for me is looking at, well, have we addressed the risk issues, and have we decreased the risk or stabilized the situation?
Well, and you're absolutely, those are fabulous outcomes. So you're way ahead of, we're going to go to outcomes in a second, but there might be some outputs, things that you could measure that would help you know whether that, kind of help you get to that idea of risk and safety.
Right.
Number of clients served. Yes, there's somebody in chat. Thank you, Erin. Number of clients served, the number of investigations, the number of people whose investigations said, were substantiated or unfounded.
Number of phone calls.
Yep.
Face-to-face contact.
Absolutely. Length of time cases open, compliance with mandates, recidivism, types of allegations. These are great examples. I think we had a couple that we can just go through, Krista, on the slide, the number.
Yes.
In case nobody had any, but you all had some, so thank you. So So services is something that Marion's going to talk about, the number of services provided to clients. I think this gets a little, to me, this is one of those places where it's like, is that an output or an outcome? I mean, the purpose of the services is to help the client have greater well-being, et cetera. But anyway, I put it as an output. Marion and I are going to arm wrestle later. About the number of MDT meetings convened. So great. You guys had some great suggestions in there. Before we go to the next slide, well, let's go to the next slide. So now we're looking at outcomes of that same training that we had just identified a slide or two ago. What were some of the outputs? So the number of people who attended. So you're holding this training with clients who are experiencing domestic violence for your APS workers. Which of the following are outcomes? And this is multiple choice. And you probably see it on your screen. Workers report more skill in working with clients experiencing domestic violence. Clients served by trained workers feel safer than those served by untrained workers. Trained workers refer more clients to domestic violence community-based services. Trained workers stay on the job longer than untrained workers. Clients with domestic violence served by trained workers return to APS at lower rates than those served by untrained workers. So the question is, the multiple choice, which of these are outcomes of that training for your workers on domestic violence?
All right, we have the poll is open. We've got some voting going on.
One of the ways I think about this is, what were you hoping for when you decided you wanted to train your workers on working with clients who are experiencing domestic violence? What were your hopes for that training? Related to either workers or to clients or to your program?
All right, give it a couple more seconds. Cast your final votes. And we will end polling now and sharing results.
Great. So let's walk through this a little bit. If it were me, I would imagine that you were doing a training so that your workers would report a greater sense of skill in working with clients experiencing domestic violence. So it's not surprising at all that you would see 74% of you thought that that was an outcome. Absolutely would be my hope and dream for a training that I was doing like that for my workers. The next one, 58%, is the second to smallest outcome, but reported by all of you, but it is definitely an outcome. I think it's the reason it probably, I'm just guessing, got a little bit lower than some of the others is that we're still not used to thinking that how do we even get that information from clients? How do we find out whether clients served by trained workers report feeling safer than those from untrained workers? Well, we have to ask the client. So that's a whole other conversation that we'll talk about in a second. The next one got 68%. Trained workers refer more clients to domestic violence. So this sort of is going to workers' competency. And yes, this is great. So your workers feel more competent. They understand the resources that are available. So I'm going to skip the next one. The clients served by domestic violence, clients with domestic violence served by the trained workers return to APS at lower rates than those untrained. Absolutely. This would probably be, hopefully, maybe in your mind, another goal. So one of the other things I think we're doing today is also identifying what are the levels of your hopes and dreams for whatever program you're involved in. And there are multiple levels, again, worker level, client level, program level. But the clients served by trained APS workers would feel, would return to APS that gets to levels of recurrence that I think would be a goal for any training, because again, it goes to clients that the risk is reduced, and it's reduced in a way that means that the client is not returning. Trained workers, the one that got the least response, just 30%, trained workers stay on the job longer than untrained workers. So this is just me opining from my little house in Ashland, Oregon. If your training does not have as a goal that your workers are more satisfied and stay on the job longer, that's a great goal. That's a great goal for doing training for your workers. It's not the kind of goal I think about most of the time. And I would love for anyone to opine like that they disagree or that they're confused by that. But I'm curious, what about having trained workers that workers by virtue of their training feel more competent, feel more efficacious, feel more comfortable in their role, that would not be a goal or a hoped for outcome? Can we maybe just get a little conversation going about that?
This is Erin from Riverside County. I actually did select this as an outcome, but I think that maybe the reason that it's a little bit ambiguous is it might not have been like an intentional outcome, right? Like we might not have done the training intending to see it increase retention, but it might have been kind of an unintended outcome of the training.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what other people feel too?
Well, I was thinking with this one, this is Sonia from Alameda County, that would be a study that would take a long time to come to that conclusion, to measure it. So it didn't really seem appealing to me, because I think to be able to determine that it would take maybe years. That's what I was thinking.
This is Michael in Fresno. So I agree with you, Sonia, in the sense of the time, but we do have data from the child welfare side, which showed that, workers who had felt confident and competent because of training they received were more likely you would see a lower turnover. So, I selected it because I'm one of these, I want the biggest bang for my buck. And I know that if staff feel that they've got the knowledge they need, then they're more inclined to stay.
There's some research out of training adult protective services, but most of it in the workforce is about child welfare. And then, so Michael, yeah, there is some research that shows that, trained workers do stay on the job longer. They do rate higher levels of satisfaction. But Sonia, I think you make a really, really good point, which is like, is that something that even though it might be a goal, even if I want to articulate the goal, how do I do it? I'm like, is this like a big old research thing? We have to get Marion to fly in from Indiana and she's got to set up a whole thing for us. So I think that's a really good point. But I want to encourage everyone to be as aspirational as possible when you're dealing with a new program, because if you can identify all your hopes and dreams for that program and sort of and give it some thought, you may reject, like, you know what, I think it's a great thing that we should know about how does by training this or by doing the example we're going to use later is it's by using an extended case management program. Are we going to see higher levels of satisfaction of workers or whatever? If you articulate it, if you identify it as a goal, you can say later, I think it's too complicated for us to measure, but that you've identified it as a goal, as a hoped for outcome. That's a really good thing, just to identify it, even if you later say I think it's too complicated for us right now. At least you've written it down somewhere and you can come back to it later. Because who knows, Marion might want to come to California and maybe that's exactly what she wants to do and she'll do it for you for free.
Why not?
I'm just joking. Why not? So, all right, let's go to the next slide, and I'm wrapping up my section. So what we've talked about, now, and I think you all are getting it and had a good understanding of it before we even started, but hopefully for some of you it's helped a little bit, but that outcomes are what you want or need to achieve. But you have to understand what your goals are, and these goals do occur at several levels, and no level is more important than the other. I mean, we just are beginning to know so much more about, if what you're experiencing is that your workers are turning over quickly, this is having an impact on your clients. these outcomes are hardly ever just pulled apart separately. The more retention your workers have, the more satisfaction your workers have, the better sense of competency or efficacy, the chances are that those are going to impact client outcomes, which we tend to hold up as the most important. And I think everybody would agree they probably are. But as I said, like, these are all so interrelated, so client outcomes, well-being, client satisfaction, reduce risk and increase safety. In the study that I'm involved in, we're actually looking at measuring how engaged was the client, so that we can, that's a whole other thing, but also how respected did the client feel? Did the client feel like their wishes were listened to? Because we wanted to get at the part of APS that is about self-determination. And then program outcomes or system outcomes. So I I don't know if there are other kinds of outcomes that people have looked at in their program or wanted to mention here in addition to these large buckets.
I don't know if APS is looking at it yet, but at some point we may also be looking at things like outcomes for perpetrators. Do they get more help? Do they do a better, are they able to move on from there, as well as like family dynamic caregiver outcomes in terms of the people around the APS client?
That's fascinating. Thank you, Lori. All right, and then the last slide, which could have been, I guess, my last slide for right now, Krista, is why care about outcomes. And I guess we could have started with this one too, but basically outcomes are important because we have to be able to say that we did what we said we would do. So if we are not able to do that, this is, I think, some of the trouble that we encounter, or the challenges we encounter in telling the story of APS. And so without client outcomes, without outcomes info, we can't actually say that we did what we would do. And I think for every story that we have about how APS makes an incredible difference in the lives of clients, we need to have a ton of data to go with it. That's just how the world is operating now. It also helps us to professionalize the field and to move a little bit more towards consistency of practice, which I think is a goal at the Administration for Community Living level, which is something about creating the profession. We're creating, as we're doing it, we're creating the profession of adult protective services. I mean, you all are creating it. It is already created, but it's continuing to morph and move towards greater professionalization. And the ability to say that we did what we said we would do and to professionalize the field is going to move the field towards greater and greater amounts of funding. But without those first two bullets, I think that that funding will be smaller. We need to be able to show the first and second bullet. So that's why we care about outcomes. And there have been a number of people who have cared enough about outcomes to study outcomes. And I'd like to turn it over to Marion now to start reviewing what do we know already from the literature. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you. So before we start, Mary, we have a question in the chat box. So Heidi is asking whether outputs are to outcomes just like objectives to goals.
That's a great analogy. So first of all, hi, Heidi. And second of all, can I think about that a little bit more? But I think that immediately feels comfortable to me. I don't know if other people want to weigh in, but thank you, Marion.
Yep, absolutely. No, I also think that's a great analogy. We can come back to it a little bit later, but I certainly feels like, outputs are things that establish, right, the data that provided us in order to capture what we can say about our story about outcomes. All right. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Marian Liu. For those who have never met me, I am such an honor to be here. So I started working with California APS, I would say probably starting 2016. So I got introduced through Jill Nielsen to PSOC, to CDSS, and Lori was in office at the time. So we worked on a few projects together, and it's such a pleasure. I see that, San Francisco leadership team is all here. Jill, Achilles, and Jamie, hi. And a lot of you I've spoken to back in 2017 when I did counting interviews. So Jeremy, and I've been emailing a lot of you recently because of the ISO matrix. So Denise from Tehama is on the line. Thank you. So I am, very happy and very excited to come here today to tell you a little bit about, the nerdy side of me, a brief history of APS Outcomes Research. And I just wanted to tell you that these are a couple of the selected APS research studies that I picked. So I'm a disclaimer is that there are more studies out there. I'll try to, mention all of them, but if I missed something that you know of, please feel free to put in the chat box. I would obviously love to learn about more of those studies as well. So why don't we get started? So the history about APS outcomes. So for each slide, I have one study presented, some of the methodologies, what are they looking at, and I've titled these slides, whose outcome, what outcomes. So going back to what Mary was talking about, there are different things that we look at, from program outcomes, client outcomes, workers outcomes. So I'm trying to, select a few different things, through different studies to highlight all these different aspects. I would love to hear about your thoughts because we just talked about the differentiation, distinction between output and outcomes. Nevertheless, even though I am presenting all these studies as outcomes studies in APS, you might feel differently, because I do with some of these studies, even though they're looking at APS outcomes, I do not necessarily, 100% agree with, everything that they look at are APS outcomes. So the 1997 study was probably, the earliest that I can find regarding APS outcomes. So in this study, the researcher conducted interviews with all 50 states in this country. And this is actually, it's a little bit, before my time, before I joined the APS and elder abuse workforce. However, I would probably guess that this is, through the help of NAPSA. That's how this study was conducted. So interviewing 50 states, APS programs, and they were trying to get at two different things: client outcomes and program outcomes. So what they were able to do is that they take a look at what are some of the client outcomes, and they categorized client outcomes as positive versus negative case closure reasons. It is, I think it's quite interesting, in terms of thinking about client outcomes, taking a look at, positive and negative case closure reasons. And if you think about it, these are client outcomes, yes, at case closure, but these are client outcomes from caseworkers' perspectives, right? And when they take a look at program outcomes, what they did is they counted the number of reports that were submitted to each state. They also take a look at substantiation rate in each state. So I'm not sure about you, but when I read this 1997 study, the first thing that came to mind is, I don't know, even though they kind of, talked about program outcomes, but things that they looked at, numbers, the rates, from my perspective, I feel like, it's not necessarily outcomes per se, it's more like output. But this is not to say that this study is not important, because it was, from what I can find, this is the first researcher who published in a peer-reviewed journal about APS outcomes. So I think it's a very important study, especially the fact that, the researchers surveyed APS in all 50 states. That's not an easy thing to do, obviously. So I think it has its place in history for sure. Although from, 25 years, well, this is, almost 25 years from 1997, when we take a look at it, I think we understand that, we can probably move forward and to take a look at something more than just the number of reports and substantiation rate. Okay, the next study, please. So this next study, now we're a little bit closer to nowadays regarding timeline. So in 2005, there are 2 researchers who looked at APS case files from 3 different cities. So they didn't specify which cities they selected or reviewed. They just said 751 cases were reviewed. So in this study, they looked at some other different things, but in terms of outcomes, what they define as outcomes is case disposition. So in terms of case disposition, what they're saying is, so in California, substantiation decision, basically. So in their study, the substantiation decision has 5 different categories. Needed and accepted. So they're talking about services needed by the client, accepted by the client. The second category is needed by the client, refused by the client. And the third category is needed by the client, but during the time when APS is involved, that potential issue is already resolved or eliminated. And then there's unfounded, and there's the last category called pending. I'm not quite sure what exactly is pending. So in this study, they used case disposition as outcomes. When I read this paper, I think it's a great step forward in terms of not just looking at the number of cases, the substantiation rate. Obviously, now we're looking at what's the result of investigation in terms of what about services provided, so on and so forth. However, I feel like having case disposition as outcomes, it kind of ignores the fact that APS caseworkers also, in addition to investigation, there's also the part of providing services, right? That follows creating a service plan and working with clients in thinking about what services are needed and can be provided and are available, so on and so forth. Okay, so before we move to the next study, any reaction so far about earlier studies on APS outcomes?
I just think, this is Michael in Fresno. I just think, because I'm looking at the title, so this really only looks at is looking at self-neglect versus all other types of abuse.
That is correct, yeah.
Which is really kind of limiting because, as we know now, self-neglect really is kind of just the progressive aging process, and really not having assistance in performing your ADLs. Right.
And I think, Michael, you're getting at kind of all the different types of abuse. How do we assess? And that kind of, I think that goes well into the next slide regarding what you talked about, risks and safety. And it's quite challenging when it's a self-neglect only case. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Nice. All right, so let's take a look at the next study included in the presentation. So this is a study conducted by, most of you might know, Pam Teester, who is a respected gerontological researcher. So she's not the first author, I know that, but her group and her colleagues has done quite a few APS related studies. So in these studies done, I would say, in the early 2000s or also, going into like 2010s, they have been looking through APS case notes, APS cases. And these series of studies, even though I only selected one to present here, what they're really doing is to take a look at continuation or discontinuation of risk, harm, or abuse. So that's what they're trying to get at. So these researchers, they measure risk reduction or discontinuation of abuse as a sign of positive outcomes. So in this particular one that I have on the slide as an example, they take a look at 1,002 cases in Kentucky. So what they're doing is they have all the cases, all the case note, all the document. I have no idea how much time they took in doing this study, which is amazing. So they have researchers sit down and take a look at everything of one case. In the end of reviewing that particular case, they made a decision in outcomes. And the way that they make that decision is they have 3 categories. Risk is reduced at the end of case closure. Risk remained to be the same, and risk increased across time. So that's the 3 categories of outcomes that you look at. So then again, I guess, I guess we're thinking about, even though the target is the client, we're interested in how the client's doing. It's the caseworkers doing the documentation. And then, interestingly, it's the researchers making that judgment call of whether the client is doing better or not. So Lori had a comment saying they did this study based on the California's day. Oh, a day in life of APS that PSOC did. Oh, very nice. I didn't know that. That is fascinating.
So Marion, if you don't mind, so one of the things that I was thinking that all 3 of these first studies is, if I got this right, that the source of the information looking at the outcomes was the case file.
That is correct.
Or a data system. This is actually the first one where I feel like these are outcomes. The others really did feel like outputs, even though they're sort of like program. This is what gets confusing to me, like program outcomes sometimes feel like outputs, or program outputs can sometimes feel like outcomes. But I think this is the first one that feels like a real outcome. But what I wanted to point out to folks was that all 3 of these, when we get to the part of our matrix, like, well, how would you measure? One of the sources that you can use to measure is your files, your data. So thanks.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I'm hoping also to, with the studies that we're selecting and, presented over here, hopefully it would be able to get you started thinking about what outcomes are you interested in looking at, and how would you be able to look at it? I know that all of the counties are getting a pot of money coming from the COVID relief fund. So thinking about, hey, how can I use that money? That's the first step, obviously. And I think some of the counties already know how they're going to use that money, but also thinking about in California, because California APS is getting the biggest pot of money from the federal government, right? So in thinking about, how do I demonstrate that it makes a difference so that continuously, if funds are still available, California can continue getting the most amount of money because we're demonstrating that we're doing a difference. I think that's quite important. So coming back to this study, like I said, so this is not the only study looking at continuation or discontinuation of risk. The same group of researchers, they also did 2 other studies on sexual abuse, and they found that about 12% of men and women were still at risk of sexual abuse at case closure. And then there's also another study by Shelley Jackson and her partner, and they found that 86% of the abuse cases were stopped at case closure. However, 43% of APS caseworkers felt that their elderly client were still at risk of future abuse. So that is a study. I think Shelley Jackson did her study in Virginia, so with Virginia APS. So there are a few studies looking at all these different risk, continuation, or discontinuation. And that led me to my own study with my colleagues. And I want to say my colleagues in San Francisco and Napa Adult Protective Services. So back in 2000, I'm forgetting which year did we get funded. I want to say 2017, I believe, maybe 2018, 18 probably. So we, this is in collaboration with this consistency work group of PSOC. And I will see some of you this afternoon, obviously, since we're still working on some of the projects. So in collaboration, from the blessing of PSOC, and then in collaboration with San Francisco and Napa Adopted Services, we used this, what we call the identification services and outcomes matrix. So the outcomes that we're looking at, just kind of, we are in line with, in previous studies, they're looking at the continuation or discontinuation of risk. Instead of saying we're looking at the discontinuation or continuation of risk, we are really trying to get at, is the abuse being stopped or not? So we have all these indicators for the different types of abuse, and we're really trying to get at, because, APS, the mission is to keep clients safe and also live independently, but also what's APS really getting at? It's getting at trying to get a look at, is abuse, neglect, exploitation happening or not? And can we, stop the abuse, neglect, and exploitation from happening? So our outcomes is to take a look at differences in all the kind of indications of abuse before APS involvement, and then at case closure, which is after APS involvement. But in addition to that, we are also very interested in looking at effective services. So this is the amazing work of San Francisco and Napa. In their documentation of service plan, we were able to extrapolate the different types of services and what are the types of services that's correlated with the drop of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. I'd also want to just mention that the state of Montana joined us and started using the ISO matrix right before the pandemic. So they've been using the ISO matrix since March 2020. We also have Tehama, I think Denise is here. Tehama County also started using the ISO matrix last summer. We have Carlos Ferris, who is scheduled to get a training in a few weeks. And if you are a Leeds County, we have funding for you to get access to the ISO matrix from the federal grants. So if you're interested, I know 17 of you already said you are interested, but then we did this during the pandemic. I don't want to pressure anyone in using the tool, obviously, but if you are interested, let me know and we will talk a little bit more. Let me show you very briefly on the outcomes that we try to get at from the ISO matrix. If you're part of PSOC, if you're part of adults, you probably have seen this. So the first thing is that we are very interested in looking at the type of abuse, the indication of those, did it drop after APS involvement? So the blue bars for the different types of abuse, we have 9 different types of abuse investigated in California. So you'll see 9 sets of bars represented here. On the very right. So Lori mentioned that, in the future, maybe we would be interested in looking at abuser. How are they doing? So on the very far right, we have abuser risk before APS involvement, after APS involvement. So the blue bars are the scores before APS involvement, so at the beginning of the case investigation, and then the orange bars are at case closure, the scores at case closure. So higher score means higher level of abuse, neglect, exploitation, and lower scores means, the abuse, neglect, exploitation, all the orange bars are indicating with APS involvement. It looks like abuse, neglect, exploitation for most type of abuse, except for sexual abuse and abduction, most type of abuse, the indication dropped. Okay, so Yolo County, Lake County, I will try to get in touch with you guys afterwards. Thank you for showing interest. All right. So the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the other, in addition to looking at after APS involvement, whether abuse, neglect, exploitation dropped. I think this slide might be a little bit small, but just so you know, essentially we're trying to get a look at whether, let's see, so effective services, we categorize all the effective services on the left based on NAMERS categories. So I will, certainly say that, not all the counties are probably doing their service plan differently. So we spend a lot of time mapping San Francisco and Napa APS services onto the NAMERS categories. And depending on the services provided in your counties, we can also, try to do these kind of things. Like we talked to Montana about their services, and their service categories are completely different from San Francisco's and Napa's. So we have to do some mapping to make sure that we can, compare and contrast across counties, across states. Still in the process of doing that, but essentially this is a table showing you on the left, there are different categories of services. On the top, there are different types of abuse, from SN stands for self-neglect, all the way to, all 9 types of abuse and abuser risk. And I can just very quickly tell you that the green cells, so like, for example, self-neglect, it is very important, the green ones, it is important to get client involved. So you need client engagement in order to make sure that, the risk, quote unquote, risk or harm or, indication, let's say indication is probably a better, more precise wording. The indication of self-neglect would drop if we have client engaged in helping, establish and selecting the services they want. And then number 2, caregiver support services. And then number 5, emergency assistance materials. Number 8, in-home assistance services. Number 10, medical and dental services, for example. Thank you, Krista. So those are, the ones that I just mentioned, and also number 18, other services. There are a lot of like translation services in San Francisco and Napa. So we thought, that might be what's driving the results. So those are the things that are associated with the decrease in the indications of self-neglect. And you can see that across the tables, there are different green cells. And that means, for different types of abuse, if you would like to think about what services would decrease the indication of those types of abuse, then you go with the green ones. Okay, Fresno County, Solano County, and also Alameda County, I will be in touch. All right, now moving on to a couple more examples of outcomes studies. So these studies are the ones that Mary mentioned at the beginning of the presentation of this webinar. These studies, so I think I listed 3 at the bottom. These are all done in Los Angeles, and specifically in collaboration with Los Angeles County's Elder Abuse Forensic Center, focusing on their financial exploitation cases. And I can probably tell you that they all focus on like criminal justice related decisions such as court referrals, prosecution, or conservatorship, partly because this, I don't think it's, I think it's, 2 separate grants, I believe. So those grants are funded by the National Institute of Justice. And when National Institute of Justice, and I guess ACO too. So whenever we have these grant opportunities, they're usually very focused. So this is one of those opportunities when NIJ, National Institute of Justice, is very interested in looking at some of the justice related outcomes. So not surprisingly, you'll see that in these studies, so referrals to court or criminal justice systems is another type of outcomes measured in these previous studies involving adult protective services. So in the 2013 study, the second one listed here, Navarro, Gasumas, and Wilbur, they found that APS cases reviewed by MDTs, including APS law enforcement and DA's office, resulted in higher proportion of pleas and convictions. And similarly, so the third study listed, Stacy Wood and her colleagues, and myself included, proudly when I was a graduate student, we found that neuropsychological evidence from MDTs increased the DA's office in filing a financial exploitation case for prosecution. And last but not least, the first study, I kind of presented it based on the years. So in 2015, Gasumas, Navarro, and Wilbur, they found that the court approved conservatorship at a higher rate when financial exploitation cases were presented to a MDT. So I think kind of even though we're talking about APS outcomes here, I don't know what all of you think. I think these justice-related outcomes can be one type of outcomes that we take a look at. I don't imagine it to be, APS is all about justice related outcomes. There are a lot more that we can take a look at, but this is something that we can pay attention to for sure to demonstrate the success of APS. But also at the same time, if you heard about kind of, what I've been describing regarding all these studies, one of the common kind of thread is that all the success that they're talking about comes from MDTs. So like the focus of the study is really kind of how APS works together with other professionals, and involving MDTs in cases for, from these studies is demonstrate positive outcomes in APS interventions. In addition to these studies, there's also an earlier study in 2012 done by Joy Erst and her colleague Smith. They found that having MDT access resulted in greater risk reduction. So they going back to the risk continuation and discontinuation model, they assessed risk continuation and discontinuation comparing cases with APS versus APS plus MDTs. And they found that, having MDT involved results in greater risk reduction. Okay, I'm gonna, again, stop myself for a second just to see if we have any comments coming in.
There's nothing in the chat besides more people interested in the isomatrix.
I would, my only comment is like it's like, this is a stupid comment, but you only measure what you set out, what you collect data on. So like this, what's interesting about these forensic center cases, I'm fairly confident that they also created a sense of worker satisfaction. Cases that were brought probably had better worker satisfaction, or they had greater sense of that the client was safer. But because it was a justice related grant, they were only looking at justice related outcomes. So that's just one of the things. That's why I think when we talk about, we have to like go really broad about what you want to know and then come back to, maybe you have a focus. This
Mhm.
was clearly focused.
Exactly. And it goes to kind of telling you what the funders are looking for, right? So I think with ACO being more interested in not just elder abuse, but APS in general, I think is very important. Whenever there's an opportunity regarding the funding of elder abuse, especially taking that special interest on APS, we should go all out and try to get at not to promise this, pie in the sky type of thing, but kind of push us forward. And just like what Mary said earlier, professionalize the field, but also, moving the field forward. I know that California is currently pushing for the bill of APS 2.0, right? So that's all those funding opportunities, I think, is for us to build what Mary often said, the APS of tomorrow.
Marion, I was just going to comment, if it's okay. I've actually remembered seeing that study that came out, and there's a great model also, I think, that they have that kind of explains how the MDT and the Forensic Center partners all come together, which is, I think, really helpful in trying to, from an advocacy perspective, trying to really demonstrate what a forensic center is, because so many people actually think it's a place where there's scientists, right, doing CSI stuff. And but I also think the fact that we now have, although what they really looked at was pretty narrow, it's compelling to boards, to other stakeholders, to know that we have an evidence-based practice that APS can rely on to actually move prosecution forward. And so I think this is one of the few studies that we have, and it's tremendously valuable. And hopefully, I think bringing it up today is great for all of us. If there is funding at the state available soon with our budget proposal, legislative proposal that's going forward, this is really should be a help for counties that want to go forward and develop their own forensic centers. It'd be really exciting to see forensic centers, across California. So.
Definitely. Thank you, Jill. And if anyone's interested in the other study about, the evaluation of MDTs, let me know. I have it, I'm such a nerd, so I have it in my folder.
I just have one quick question, just a point of clarification. You were mentioning APS cases involving law enforcement resulted in, and then I did not hear the rest of it.
So this is, the outcomes are listed on the slide. So prosecution, so DA's office are more likely to take on the case and work on it and, file a prosecution, higher rates of conviction after DA's office takes on the case. And also the study, I think it's the first study listed here, the 2015 study here. Gasumas and his colleagues did a study looking at MDT involvement that kind of results in higher rates of conservatorship.
I got that. Okay, so when DA is involved, that's what I missed. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking the clarifying question. Okay.
In Solano County.
Yes.
My question is, how do people draw the DA into elder abuse cases? Have you found any good research about that?
Ooh,
because
that's a good question. Let me very quickly, I'm like a robot. Let me take a look at my memory store.
thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Well, Gwendolyn, right?
Yes, it's Gwendolyn in Solano County.
Okay. I don't think I know of any studies discussing DAs, how do we draw DAs involvement? But I do know that I think this is in Washington, the state of Washington, I believe. So they have like the DA's office really involved in looking at elder abuse cases. So not necessarily APS cases, but elder abuse cases. It seems like you need to have like a champion. I think most of you know Paul Greenwood in San Diego County, who retired a couple of years ago. It just feels like in the DA's office, there needs to be someone who's passionate about this issue and really wanted to a lot of the times works with APS, right, in taking on these cases. And I know that some of the counties do a good job in trying to convince the law enforcement and the DA's office in saying, well, elder abuse is not just civil, like family dispute type of cases. Like there's criminal aspects in all these discussion, and that's probably how they draw DA's attention to the cases. Mary, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that it's a little bit apart from what we're talking about today, but just as a resource, so the Department of Justice, so the Federal Department of Justice has an Elder Justice Initiative. And if you put into Google Department of Justice, Elder Justice Initiative, you'll get taken to their homepage, and they have a whole multidisciplinary team technical assistance center. Then some of you might know Talitha Gwynn, who ran the MDT and the Forensic Center in San Francisco for several years. She will talk to you about this very common problem, which is how do we engage law enforcement partners in multidisciplinary teams? So I'm sure they have a ton of information, but also what's even better is like they'll just walk you through like, this is what's worked. This is what worked in Iowa. This is what worked in this county over here. So I would recommend them to all of you if you are having issues with your multidisciplinary team. But to the point here, though, I think is, when you start a multidisciplinary team, what are you hoping for? Why start one? What are your hopes, your dreams, I love this expression a friend used to use, your hopes, your dreams, your IRAs. What are the goals you're hoping to see when it comes to these various levels? In this case, the Justice Department wanted to know about justice-related results. But a lot of people were very upset to see rates of conservatorship because APS has had traditionally over time, unfortunately, this idea that, okay, all APS does is put people under conservatorship, so that there was an increase in conservatorship for cases that went through the Forensic Center, while we all know that that's something that's done very carefully with a lot of consideration of the client's abilities and looking at supported decision-making processes and least restrictive alternatives. The study wasn't able to go into all those nuances. So like forensic centers equaled higher rates of conviction, or what was the racial breakdown of those convictions? Was that a good goal? Is that a good outcome? Is that a bad outcome? And the same with conservatorship. So outcomes are not without controversy. Back to you, Marion.
So this is Francisco from LA County. We actually have an MOU with our district attorneys, and they attend the Forensic Center meetings. It's every Thursday, and also our county council, public guardian, district attorney, and other DHS, they also attend these meetings because we do have an MOU with them. So they are to participate in the meetings. Now, district attorney does have their own elder abuse section or unit. So they do work in collaboration with the with other entities, because we do bring them into our Forensic Center meetings.
Great. Awesome. I just want to do a time check because I really want to do the large group processing and small breakout group. And I know we could talk about this for a very, very long time. So,
but yeah, no, it's exciting to see, people's interest on this topic, because it definitely sounds like, we all know that APS clients, they need a lot of different services, and having to kind of pull in other professionals, it's very important for sure. So let me move on to the next slide, I have a couple more that I will go through very quickly. So in addition to some of those program outcomes, like mentioned, relying on caseworkers and doing data collection, researchers going into APS cases and looking at, whatever outcomes that they define. We also have a few different other type of studies. So like this one, they're interested in worker outcomes, and this is a pretty new article that was just published in 2019. And actually next week, NAPSA's Research to Practice Interest Group, we're hosting a journal club on this particular article. So we just spoke to the authors. If you want to learn more about this study, please feel free to, put in the chat box, let me know. I can send you the invitation to the journal club. So this study, they looked at 3 groups of APS caseworkers in New York City. And they did a training that, is an 8-hour training. And before the training, also after the training, they did a pre-test and also a post-test to take a look at, what did they learn after they're involved in the training. So there are a couple more. I wouldn't say there are a lot of other training related studies in APS, but there are a couple more studies done a little bit earlier, like in 2008. I think there's another study on APS training. So they are the kind of the way that you kind of measure outcomes is usually done in a pre-test and post-test kind of modality. Okay. Next slide, please. So the next study is also these researchers. I think it's the same group of researchers from New York. They are very interested in thinking about, APS caseworkers' well-being. So they take a look at 410 workers and their supervisors. They did a big survey. In the study, they said in a large study. They didn't say it, but based on the author's affiliation, I'm pretty sure this is also in New York. They looked at worker outcomes. So they looked at quite a few different things: job satisfaction, compassion satisfaction. The definition of compassion satisfaction is the fulfillment from helping others and positive collegial relationship in one's work. So that's what they looked at. They also looked at burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and hazard exposures, all these different things in trying to get at APS workers' outcomes. So the last 2 studies I want to go over are related to client outcomes. So one of the most, I would say, in the APS history, I would say, one of the first true client outcome studies is done by David Burns in Toronto, California. Sorry, not California, Canada, Toronto, Canada. So he adopted this goal attainment scaling from, this is not new in social work, but never used in elder abuse. So he adopted that particular model and have caseworkers work with their clients directly in setting up the goals of what do they want to see in terms of social support, service access, health, functioning, enhancing independence, all these different aspects, and obviously, protective measures as well, all these different aspects. What's the client's priority in their service plan? What does the client want to see happen? And once they set up the goals, then they come back a little bit later after service provision in trying to get at whether all the different areas of priorities have they improved or not. And there's, the calculation of whether there's a positive outcome is a little bit complex. So it's not just, 1 + 1 = 2 kind of calculation. It has some pretty complex calculation in the background before they made the decision that, APS is making a positive difference. And the study was done in May. And I think it's kind of, because of the complexity regarding involving the clients, as well as the time that caseworkers needs to be involved in speaking with the clients, their sample size is relatively small, but makes a huge difference. Obviously, this is, like I said, one of the most important studies in looking at direct client outcomes. Next slide, the last slide before we go to the discussion. So the last study that I just wanted to touch upon, this is a study done by Booker. So this is also quite popular, I think, among APS staff, looking at client outcomes. So they did a survey for 77 clients with self-neglect substantiation in one of the counties in Texas APS. So Texas APS is one of those states that has a statewide case management system. So they have a lot of APS. I'm thinking that I shouldn't say this, but well, just sneak peek. We'll take a look at Texas APS. What are they doing next time in the refresher? But yeah, so essentially this study, they pretty much give the clients a satisfaction survey and ask the client to respond to, what they think about APS. And they got a pretty positive response. Like 80-something% of the clients are pretty happy with the services that they received, which I think is a really good result. Thinking about a lot of the self-neglect clients are probably not that, willing to admit that they are in a situation that they need help. All right, so I'm going to stop myself here and
Great, thanks, Marion. It looks like you have a couple interested folks in your journal meeting, Jamie and Aaron.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'll hand it back over to I think Mary to talk about the large group discussion and the matrix.
So we wanted to, this is a filled in matrix, but we're going to be giving you all, or you have somewhere that Krista is going to explain, a blank matrix. And I wanted to just walk through this filled in matrix. What we wanted to do is to sort of create a way to think about going from outputs to outcomes, or as Heidi said, is it like objectives to goals? So what we wanted to do in the small groups is we're going to be talking about this idea that I know has been talked about in this group before, but the idea of implementing an extended services or sort of case management piece to APS. But we didn't want to use that example to fill in the matrix. But if we start on the left, let me just walk you through it. If you start on the left-hand side, so the project and task, I'm pointing to it on my own computer, like you can see me, like, oh, look right here. The project and task is, thank you, Krista, would be, for example, the extended case management, the extended services or case management. In this case, we've talked a lot about what are some of the issues what are some of the examples when you're doing a training for your staff. So there's like, we've talked about this, the outputs and metrics are things like, oh, how many people attended, just like today, how many hours of training was there, how did people rate the training? So that's just the rating at the end of the day. That's the sort of, oh, the speaker was good, she was on point, the room was too cold kind of thing. But so that's outputs and metrics. When we get to the questions, these are sort of what I think we put in our heads as we're designing as we have the idea that we want to do a training for our staff. You're not doing a training for no reason. Like, why do you want to have a training for your staff? So you're thinking, of course, ahead of time, like, well, we want the workers to be more effective. We want them to be more efficient. We want them to have more confidence. So that's underneath where it says under questions, Krista, thanks. And this sort of thing that we've started to talk about, we want them to stay on the job longer. So when you're thinking about the training, you probably have some things in mind already, like our workers need to be more efficient, for example. But we also might be thinking in terms of your clients, like the result of this training for the clients should be what? We think that the clients should see greater satisfaction, or we would see greater levels of safety and risk. So if someone is getting trained, as the example earlier, on how to work with clients who are experiencing domestic violence, you would be able to tell later, yes, we feel like we did a better job reducing risk with this clientele. So those are just some examples. We won't go into the others. So one of the ways that then we go from the question, which is how did the training change the worker, the client, whatever, is like then kind of quantifying that, sort of setting a goal. And I think this part is probably, I think this is probably the hardest part. But maybe you go in with having assigned, like, I'd like to see 5% more workers reported a sense of increased effectiveness. Okay, that's super low. Let me say, like, as a result of this training, 75% of the workers later said that they felt more effective working with people with domestic violence. Or let's say you go in with an idea that, like, I'd really like to see. So you're benchmarking this. This is not essential. And sometimes benchmarking is like, I don't know. I don't even know what to say. So maybe you don't benchmark it, but you know that you want to see these kinds of changes. And then the final column is, okay, now the rubber hits the road. You can't measure what you didn't collect. And I think, so going into the fact that you're having a training, to using this example, what do you want to know? So you want to see that the workers feel more efficient or more confidence, or you want to see that the clients experience greater safety. So what would you have to do before you had the training to put in place so that you could answer those questions as to whether or not you reached that goal? And I don't know, Marianne, if you, having designed studies, if you want to add to this at all.
I thought you summarized it very nicely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there, and from the studies that Marianne reviewed, you see multiple ways that people have done this. A lot of the early studies were mostly just looking at APS cases, or if there were data systems, there was crunching the data system to say, oh, look, clients of people who, or clients that went through the MDT, when you do the case review, they had higher rates of convictions, or the perpetrators had higher rates of convictions. So this part is really important, and it's the part we almost always do last. And so I think, if nothing else from today's training, one of my outcomes would be that we identify what would be some of the mechanisms. So you could do case review or data set review. You could ask your workers 3 months after the training, 6 months after the training, do you feel more effective? Do you feel more satisfied? You can survey your clients. Like, most people in APS, when you talk about surveying clients, they were like, I don't, what? Like, actually ask the client? I think there's a lot of fear that the clients will say bad things. But the study that Marianne, the very last study she just reviewed, that 77 clients, self-neglecting clients in a Texas county, had 80% satisfaction. That's self-neglecting clients. So I think I could tell you a little story from our APS client outcome study, which is underway right now. Just one of the first things that happened is the director of the study got a call from a client, because on the form we're required to say, like, if you have a question about this study, you can reach, Mary Toomey. It wasn't Mary Toomey, but the client called and said, kind of misunderstanding, thinking that we were part of the APS. She said, I'm just calling to say that I was so helped by your program, and I am so grateful to you. And so we transcribed it, and I can't identify the state, but we told all the states, like, this was one of the first things we got, is somebody picked up the phone and said thank you to the APS program in their state. So I think maybe one of my goals in pre-retirement will be to try to encourage APS programs to do more client satisfaction, because I think that the fears are unfounded. But anyway, so those are some of the ways that you can collect this data. So now let's look at an example we haven't looked at before, which is a multidisciplinary team meeting. So your outputs are like, please do not report as an outcome that we met 4 times. That is not an outcome, it is an output. Number of people who attended each meeting. I cannot tell you how many times I made these things sound like outcomes in grant reports. Yes, we had all these wonderful outcomes. We met a lot, and we met for hours, and we had all these people here. That is not an outcome. But anyway, they took it. Now we get to the questions. How did meeting change your workers' sense of confidence? How did meeting with the MDT change what happened to the client? Or how did meeting change what happened in your program in terms of, like, for example, clients coming back into APS? What were your goals when you set up the multidisciplinary team? Do you want to see higher rates of something, higher rates of conviction, higher rates of guardianship or conservatorship rather? Do you want to see so whatever it is you want to see, we want to benchmark that and identify it. And then we need to figure out, how are we going to answer that question? How are we going to know whether we had higher rates of client satisfaction or client safety or worker retention or worker sense of efficacy? So let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Krista. When we think about this in terms of an extended services case management program, and I don't know if anybody needs to sort of give background as to this, or you all have talked about it enough that Krista or Lori or Rabaz?
This has kind of been a thread that's been running through, and then with the CWDA budget proposal, we've covered it quite a bit. So,
Okay.
But if anybody has questions, please either unmute or chat.
So if people have talked about it, then you might be able to say, what would be some of the outputs that you would expect to be able to measure for a program like that? You can just shout them out or put them in chat.
Reduced number of clients that come back into our APS system.
Fantastic. And so just the number of clients that were served, and then the number of clients that returned, number of recurrence. We can go ahead, Krista, and click through, because I want to get to the discussion. The number of the days the client is enrolled in this program, the number of services the client received. And thank you for that other comment. The other was like how many cases recurred. So let's go to the next one, which is how many outcomes. Oh, I think that, sorry, I should have changed that slide. It says outputs again, but in the body of the slide, it says what would be some outcomes. So when you thought about setting up a extended services case management program, what were you hoping you could achieve? The clients clearly needed it. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
More time for the APS worker to investigate new reports of abuse.
So you wanted the worker to have more time?
The APS worker would have more time because they're not doing as much long-term case management because there's help, and then they can go into the next case and investigate.
Got it. Go ahead, Marian. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that this is related to caseload, I feel like. I mean, if we're holding on, well, not holding on, but if we're conducting extended services to our clients, then obviously we won't be able to, say like have caseworkers have like 50 cases per month, 50 new cases per month or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So that, go ahead, Lori.
I was going to say, Jeremy put in reduced recidivism, and I would add that the service plans were more completely accomplished, that you could make a more elaborate service plan and make sure that each step of it actually happened. I'm not saying that well.
This is Martha in Sacramento, and Lori, along that line, I was going to say linkage to services versus just referrals, because a lot of times we're making as many referrals as we can, but we don't, I mean, part of the problem and the reason people come back is they really don't get linked to the service.
That is so well said. Yep.
Yeah, so that warm handoff, more warm handoffs than referrals. And some follow-up, did it actually happen? Did the services you put in the service plan, did they happen? Did they meet the need? And if they didn't meet the need, what do you do next? Or is there something to do next? So that's what I mean by kind of extending what happens with the service plan.
And Chris has said a longer term safety for client. So be an increase in that.
We can click through some of the ideas that we had thrown up on the slide. The client's report, higher well-being, and if you're not asking the client, maybe the proxy for this, if you don't feel like you can ask the client, is that the client does not come back into the system, or the client is linked to services. The first comment, which kind of threw me, so I apologize if I look vacant, which is kind of I do that more often than I like, which I think was maybe about, the worker has more time. Maybe we say, workers who use the new program report greater levels of satisfaction because they have more time. Or your workers are more effective or more efficient because they have this help. And then of course, recurrence or recidivism, fewer clients return to APS. And I think that there are a ton of outcomes in addition to outputs for an extended services case management program. And what we wanted to do is now move you into small groups to basically fill out the matrix, which we showed earlier. But this time you would be filling it out with your hopes and your dreams for an extended case management project. What are the outputs that you would expect? But more, I think we really want you to focus on what would be the outcomes and how would you get the data to answer the questions. Did we make a difference? Did this program make a difference? How did it make a difference? To whom did it make a difference? And how would you get that? And again, those could be file review. It could be something you put in your data system so that you're asking a specific question. It could be asking your workers. It could be asking the client. So that's what the mechanism for how to collect information. How are you going to do that? So let's go to the next slide. And I think I turn it over to you here. Oh, so please, in your small group, please designate someone who can report on behalf of your small group back to the large group. And I don't know, Krista, you can do a time check and let me know.
Yeah, we don't have, unfortunately, we've had such a great conversation, but that's okay, because we'll have time for small group in the booster as well. So we're going to put you in for about 12 minutes and then have you come on back and we'll wrap up. So Rabaz has put the questions into the chat box and that'll follow you into the small groups. Rabaz has put you into small groups of about 4 or 5 folks. If you have any questions or need help getting out, you click join and you can return to the main session. And like Mary said, be sure to think about that mechanism for collecting the information. So lofty dreams and dreams for outcomes, but how do you actually collect that info? And I think at this point, let's go ahead and stop recording, Rabaz.